Fox's X-Men films have a weird legacy, don't they? On one hand, they are partially responsible for the modern superhero boom, helping popularize multiple characters who, to this day, remain, frankly, iconic. This franchise produced peak superhero films, from X2 to First Class to Logan, and a lot of not peak films. However, not every mutant got their time to shine, at least fairly anyway. Cyclops, the leader of the X-Men, was reduced to a fairly minor, maybe disappointing, figure. Jubilee was constantly teased, but never fully showcased. Emma Frost was all levels disappointing both times they adapted her. Yeah, I didn't forget you, X-Men Origins Wolverine. I remember your Emma Frost, that version of you. But I think the most inexplicable failure of the franchise is a character who was not just noteworthy, she showed up in almost every single film. The majority of the franchise is centered around her actions. Raven Darkholme, aka Mystique. Mystique in the X films is Professor Xavier's adoptive sister, who's part of Xavier's first class of X-Men. At first, the romantic interest of Beast, she ends up joining Magneto. She's experimented on by Bolivar Trask, or at least Bolivar Trask's team, and this experimentation is used to help create the Sentinel program, or at least advance it. Depending on the timeline, because X-Men films are wonky, she's either a loyal member of Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants, before being depowered and dropped by Magneto, after impersonating Bolivar Trask, who inexplicably is both a different actor and alive, or she almost assassinates the president in Trask in the 70s and becomes a figure of revolution for mutant kind before being slain by the Phoenix, very anticlimactically. And you can't help but feel that Jennifer Lawrence just wanted out of the franchise at that point, but I digress. And somewhere along the way, maybe she gives birth to Nightcrawler with the mutant Azazel? Well, maybe? We'll get to that in a bit. Either way, it's quite the story, but it isn't Mystique's story. Not even a fucking little bit, actually. First off, Mystique in the comics is much older and far more adventurous prior to ever encountering the X-Men. Also, she's not Xavier's sister. They fucking hate each other. Or for that matter, she doesn't really like Magneto all that much either. Mystique's story is defined by affairs with connections and establishments and sweeping romance, but not the ones the film shows us. I think in part the X-Men films helped erase one of the most important early queer romances in Marvel Comics. One that, honestly, Marvel Comics has also tried to downplay themselves for the last 30 years until fairly recently. Also, Wolverine's involved in Mystique's story, way more than Professor X is, because of course he is. He's the most popular X-Men character. Mystique is actually comparable to Logan, in that they're both extremely old. Due to their mutant genes, she ages incredibly slowly. She was active decades before depicted childhood in the X-Men films takes place, all the way back to the 19th century. You know, in the film, she's about 1940, she's a kid. In the comics, she was already a fully grown adult by that point. In 19th century London, Mystique became a detective, first taking up the moniker of Eric Raven. This proves Mystique never had a problem being male or female, so long as she had a good identity that you could exploit to benefit herself. But she soon took a different identity, one more memorable to modern audiences: Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, in the Marvel Universe, Sherlock Holmes is real. Arthur Conan Doyle based his stories off of his real-life exploits, and Holmes is Mystique. Yeah, that's the comics for you. It was around this point Mystique meets Irene Addler. Yes, again, Sherlock Holmes's Irene Adler's a reference, who is also a mutant. Specifically, Irene Addler is the identity of the mutant Destiny, a figure who the X-Men films completely erase. This despite Destiny being one of the most important figures to Mystique's life. She is one of a small handful of people Mystique truly loves. Destiny's mutant abilities allow her to see briefly into the future, but she went blind after making multiple prophecies about the next 2 centuries. With Mystique's help, the two of them decide to work together to prevent the worst of these events from transpiring. They essentially become reverse time travel agents. Time travel is a major thing in the X-Men comics, but most orchestrators of the time travel mechanics, they travel from the future to the past, like Cable, Bishop, Rachel Summers, Strife, Legion, and these antics often either create or ruin the timeline.
I'm Cable, and I'm from the future, and I like blowing shit up. Pew 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 pew!
Legion, traveling back in time to kill Magneto, his father Professor Xavier's mortal enemy, for example, results in Professor X protecting his best friend's life, dying in the process. Legion ironically killed his own father. This results in Magneto forming the X-Men and Apocalypse taking over America. This is the Age of Apocalypse storyline that Bishop has to time travel back in the past to stop. However, Mystique and Destiny take a very different path. They change the future from the past because they can foresee it. Their actions, however, would inadvertently create several dark timelines, including the Days of Future Past storyline, when Mystique and Destiny, along with their newly formed Brotherhood of Mutants, try to assassinate Senator Kelly, something that the films kind of adapt to when Mystique kills Bolivar Trask in the original timeline. Also, Mystique is also involved with the death of Senator Kelly in the films, though that happens in the first X-Men film, not in Days of Future Past. Anyway, during her time as Sherlock Holmes, Mystique encounters Nathaniel Essex, aka Mr. Sinister. Mystique was one of the first people to capture and arrest Essex, and she does the other Sherlock Holmes stories too, like the Hound of Baskervilles and all that. Eventually, Irene and Mystique part ways as Mystique travels to America. It would not be the last time Mystique and Destiny reunite, however, they break up and come together multiple times in history. I want to pause here to analyze what the Fox films lost by ignoring Mystique's detective arc, aside from a chance to compete with the BBC Sherlock show and its rival show Elementary when they were in their peak popularity.
What the hell are you doing?
It's not entirely fair to say that Fox refused to adapt the storyline, because the Sherlock Holmes thing is a retcon. Like, Sherlock Holmes existed in Marvel before this, but it wasn't confirmed it was Mystique until much later. The Mystique Sherlock Holmes story, that was recorded in X-Men The Wedding Day Special, a one-off comic published during the Krakoa arc for Pride Month. Writer Kieran Gillen decided to make the story of Eric Raven and Irene Addler, which did exist already in the comics beforehand, into the Sherlock Holmes story as well, turning Mystique into an iconic figure from literature. If you're familiar with Gillen's other work, this tracks. He does that a lot. Gillen also canonized a key element of Mystique's backstory, the relationship between Mystique and Destiny being romantic. You see, it was heavily implied they were a thing for decades, but Marvel never committed to the bit. Kieran Gillen made sure that was canon. But the story about Mystique and Destiny meeting, that's traced back to the first issue of Extreme X-Men, published in 2001. Gillen just updated the older story about Eric Raven and made it into Sherlock Holmes. But the foundation was always there, and it was there and established a year after the first X-Men film dropped. Meanwhile, Destiny and Mystique, they've been together since Mystique's first appearance. We'll get to that much later. The singular choice to get rid of Destiny eradicates a core driving constant throughout Mystique's story, her only companion. Imagine Captain America without Peggy Carter, or Spider-Man without either MJ or Gwen Stacy. It would be pretty weird, right? But on the other hand, without this backstory, you lose Mystique being a brilliant figure who adapts to any culture she's in, even if she has to change genders to do so. Now, Film Mystique does change gender too. She takes over the role of Senator Kelly for a while, but she often inhabits lives that already exist. She doesn't create new identities out of nothing. Not usually, anyway. Comic Mystique does. She's very creative that way. And it shows something crucial. Mystique is not only motivated to protect mutant rights, in fact, she really doesn't care. Even ignoring the future changing adventures with Destiny, Mystique becomes a figure of status in her various roles, because she wants to for herself. She becomes a man not because she wants to be particularly masculine. She becomes a man because she can occupy a higher station in life. Mystique in the films always had a greater purpose, especially when Jennifer Lawrence, fresh off the Hunger Games, took over the role. Mystique kind of becomes Katniss Everdeen in X-Men Apocalypse. The original trilogy frames Mystique as Magneto's right-hand lady until X3, where she's depowered. But under Lawrence, she's a revolutionary. She's a sympathetic terrorist. Even as a hero, she works to save the world. But in the comics, Mystique isn't a hero. She's selfish. She's in it for herself. She is a villain who, unless you're Destiny, she will stab you in the back to get ahead. She'll even stab her own children in the back to get ahead. She's in it for herself, which makes her a great villain. She'll do things like take down Nathaniel Essex for selfish reasons. She'll work with the heroes for selfish reasons. She is ultimately entirely self-serving, which leads to the next milestone in Mystique's life, the 1920s, where she encounters a familiar face. One interesting dynamic teased at but never explored in the X-Men films is Mystique's rivalry with Wolverine, in that it sets up, in the first film, a fight. They fight in that first film. It's the big showcase fight, really. And there's a tension teased next to, a sexual tension. But it never comes up again. Even in Days of Future Past, Wolverine barely has any connection to Mystique. Her connection is far more to Beast, who has a romance that falls apart due to Hank's insecurities about their mutations. But then there's the comics. In the comics, Mystique has a love-hate relationship with Wolverine. They've been fighting for decades, back and forth. I'd argue Mystique is up there with Sabretooth, Silver Samurai, and Omega Red as one of the most persistent and dangerous foes Wolverine has ever faced. And in many cases, Mystique wins. Hell, Mystique sent Wolverine to hell at one point, and then Wolverine killed her after she helped him get out of hell. It's a whole thing. But she gets better, don't worry. Comics are fucking weird. Hell, she gets better because the Hand helps her out. Yeah, the Daredevil villains, the Hand, they bring Mystique back. Comics are fucking weird, man. When you look at the full scope of all the characters interact, it's pretty fucking weird out there. But anyway, that all started after the two of them were paired up in a Mexican desert execution. They were just lined up for the firing squad. Mystique was to be killed because her blue skin made people think she was a witch. Meanwhile, Wolverine stole a horse. That seems fitting. The two escape and end up going on a heist together, which naturally Mystique backstabs everyone on the heist for to get everything for herself. She turns in everyone else and she throws Logan off a train and gets away with everything. By the way, how did she convince Logan to help her on this heist? Well, her sex appeal. She flirted with him and seduced him. That's how she got him on the heist. And then threw him out of train. All that's to say that any interaction with Wolverine and Mystique is impacted by how in their first appearance, Mystique beat Wolverine and ran away with all the cash after hitting on him for several times. It's kind of important too. It establishes Mystique can't be trusted, Mystique actually one-upped Logan, and there is some sexual tension between them, maybe even sexual anger. I believe at one point there may have been plans to include Mystique in the Wolverine prequel film, X-Men Origins Wolverine, because in the video game, which is based on an earlier script and earlier script ideas, Mystique shows up as a CIA contact for Stryker's team of mutants. She works with them, but she has moral objections to Stryker's actions. Again, this is a non-canon game and takes many liberties with the script the film ultimately goes with, but there are efforts taken to make Mystique seem somewhat heroic. She sees figures like Sabretooth as too cruel, too sadistic. This is not the case in the comics. In the comics, Mystique loves Sabretooth, sensually. Around World War II, Mystique would disguise herself as a German spy, and ends up hooking with Wolverine's greatest enemy, Sabretooth. And the result of this affair was a child, Graydon Creed, who would go on to found the Friends of Humanity, and an anti-mutant hate group. And the source of Graydon's hatred? Mystique. When Mystique realized Graydon didn't have any mutant powers, she ditched him, inadvertently creating a threat that would massacre countless mutants. She created an enemy to her kind. Until, of course, he's assassinated by Mystique. Yeah, actually, it's funny, Mystique multiple times tries killing Graydon Creed, but this one stuck. Graydon was killed in X-Factor issue 130, back in 1997, a team-up book that featured Mystique as a hired gun for the US government. But we learn in X-Men Forever issue 2, published 3 years later, that the assassin was Mystique, because she's present for the assassination but doesn't commit in the X-Factor book. But we find out that because of time travel shenanigans, she's sent back in time and kills Graydon Creed while she's there watching Graydon Creed get killed. It's a whole fucking thing. Listen, the point is, this all happened and was completed long before the film started. The 90s cartoons even showed Mystique's various children calling her out for being a shitty mom. This was adapted and established storytelling before the films. Mystique being the source of essentially a hate group due to her own petty nature is absolutely great character writing. There are so many levels of irony, especially considering that she originally was trying to fix the future with Destiny. But without Destiny, she ends up screwing it up more, and then has to fix it herself. While Days of Future Past does illustrate that her actions can cause a future crisis, at least she was trying to fight someone who was against mutant con. You can justify it, you can spin it. We did see Mystique cause problems, but there was short-term logic behind it. But in this story, Mystique is just an asshole to her own son, and that causes her son to be a monster. Would Graydon Creed be as evil as he is if Mystique loved her child? Probably not. But because he has mommy issues now, Graydon decides to become a terrorist and make a terrorist organization and massacre countless mutants because mommy didn't give him more hugs. It's incredibly pathetic, but incredibly human. a true tragedy of Mystique's own making. Mystique does not save mutant kind, she causes it more problems by being selfish. So Mystique personally outsmarting and manipulating Wolverine's personal gain, and then mothering a child with Wolverine's greatest enemy that would then cause problems for Wolverine and the X-Men for decades to come, it certainly seems like Mystique in the film was affectionate to the wrong member of Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants, huh? I mean, Sabretooth is right there. Are they doing anything? Is Mystique doing anything with Azazel? We'll get that in a second. Let's jump ahead a little bit, because there's a couple storylines Mystique is most well known for in the comics. The big thing the films never included, one of the biggest wastes of potential in the whole series. While Graydon Creed is a big deal, sure, her son Nightcrawler and adoptive daughter Rogue are substantially more important, especially to the films, because the films adapted Rogue and Nightcrawler multiple times, as a matter of fact. So after seducing Victor, Mystique decided to stay in Germany for a little bit and marry a baron, specifically Baron Christian Wagner. So again, Mystique is using her powers for personal gain, and no greater angle or goal than that. She wants to live a life of luxury, she marries a baron. But the thing is, despite the baron being head over heels for Mystique, or the version of Mystique posing for him as a normal human being, Mystique was incredibly unfaithful, which resulted in her getting pregnant and giving birth to a blue baby named Kurt Wagner, aka Nightcrawler, my favorite of the X-Men. Mystique also kills her husband at some point. Now, at first we assume the father is the Baron. That makes sense. For many years in the comics, that was the case. That changed. You see, we enter a phase of Marvel where every writer wants their own spin at the Nightcrawler story. Who is Nightcrawler's daddy? In Uncanny X-Men issue 428, during the infamous Chuck Austen run of the book, it's revealed that Nightcrawler's father is Azazel, a demon. Well, okay, actually no, that was later retconned also. He's not a demon, he's actually an immortal mutant who spawned a group of mutants known as the Neophem that look like demons and live in hell, I guess. Anyway, Mystique and Azazel have an affair, meaning that the religious Nightcrawler's father is a demon, until he's not a demon, he's a mutant. He's a demonic-looking mutant. Point is, it's really fucking weird how writers keep changing the story around, isn't it? Except no, it turns out, none of that matters. Toss all that out. Azazel is not Nightcrawler's father, because in X-Men Blue Origins, a book written 20 years later by C. Spurrier, we learn, no, Mystique wasn't just cheating on the Baron with Azazel, she was cheating on Azazel with Destiny. Yeah, Irene Adler comes back, because Mystique convinced the Baron to bring Irene Adler on as a maid, and between the affairs with Azazel and her married life with the Baron, Mystique would have intimate moments with Irene. And during this, due to Mystique's shape-shifting ability, she gets Irene pregnant. Yeah, so Nightcrawler has two moms, and despite having intimate love with two other men, Mystique doesn't get pregnant from them. In fact, Mystique wasn't even pregnant at all. She faked being pregnant to keep Azazel interested, because Azazel was convinced that Mystique's baby was his. And she had to pretend she was pregnant to keep Azazel interested, because Destiny predicted Azazel would have a use to them in the future. So, okay, hang on, let me unpack this for you. She baby traps Azazel, leads the Baron on, and gets another woman pregnant despite being a woman herself. However, in the process of abandoning Nightcrawler, she was filled with so much guilt that she went to Professor Xavier to erase the memory of her guilt so she could function, while Destiny forgot she was ever pregnant at all. And this is their choice, they choose this. I feel this adds needed vulnerability to Mystique, because however cruel her actions are, she does feel guilt from them. She's not a total monster, but she has to turn herself into a monster. The only way she can function with her own actions is to literally rewire her brain around feeling guilt. And she's aware Nightcrawler's her son, but she suppressed the feelings of guilt over it. In other words, she isn't naturally without empathy. She has to deliberately make herself that way. It's a choice. So again, just to unpack all this, she used her position to have an affair with Irene Adler while enjoying the Baron's wealth, all while baby trapping a mutant pretending to be the king of hell. We got all that, right? Got all that? Good. Now, in fairness, at the time the X-Men film started, all we knew was that Mystique was Nightcrawler's mom. Though now I guess Destiny is Nightcrawler's mom, which is whatever. I mean, I get, is Mystique Nightcrawler's daddy? I don't know. His other mom? Is Mystique daddy? Answer it in the comments. That's a dangerous question to ask my audience on the internet. Anyway, at this time, the X-Men films had started, so all we knew was that Mystique had Nightcrawler. Chuck Austen, in his run on Uncanny X-Men, introduced Azazel. That was in 2003. In other words, the same year X2, the movie that introduced Nightcrawler, debuted. And yet, Despite Mystique and Nightcrawler sharing a meaningful scene together in X2, never do they say that Mystique is Nightcrawler's mother. Now keep in mind, this is a storyline that both the 90s cartoon and X-Men Evolution adapted, that Mystique abandons Nightcrawler, along with Rogue being Nightcrawler's adoptive sister, something the films never even try to adapt, and we'll get to that in a second. But the problem is the films never rectify that. You can say, oh, they're setting it up, but to set it up, you have to actually pay off at some point. There are odd teases between Mystique and Nightcrawler in Dark Phoenix and Apocalypse, almost 2 decades later, but the films never confirm Mystique is his mom. But they do introduce Azazel as part of the Hellfire Club in First Class, only for him to be killed off between First Class and Days of Future Past. And during this time, Mystique and Azazel do not have a conversation. They team up, but they don't have a conversation. But 20 years after First Class, Nightcrawler's around in Apocalypse. So that implies maybe Mystique did have a kid with Azazel, and that's Nightcrawler. But gone are the affairs, the queer texts, the marrying into royalty, the selfishness of Mystique's actions, which then begs the question, why would Mystique abandon Nightcrawler? Because in the original story, she's run out of town by the fearful villagers. They see a baby with blue skin, they run her out. But this version of the character doesn't have that. Plus, she's more selfless than selfish. You would think she'd maybe bring the kid to a loving mutant family to raise, or Xavier, not dump him in the lap of the Munich circus. So basically, what kind of mother is Mystique in these films? Is she even a mother? Well, we don't know. They don't tell us. We're left to guess. But there's no official confirmation in the films that Mystique is Nightcrawler's mom, despite Mystique being Nightcrawler's mom being one of the most prevalent stories surrounding Mystique. Because they never tell us. They never confirm it. They kill Mystique off before confirming Nightcrawler is her son. They just chose not to adapt it, which is bizarre considering how much time they spend adapting Beast and Mystique's relationship when Beast and Mystique do not have a romance in the comics. This personal tie between Nightcrawler, Rogue, Graydon Creed, and Mystique is one of those complicated soap opera relationships that really demonstrates the human drama that drives X-Men as a story. It's what brings us back, the soap opera element of it. And the films just completely waste it, despite setting everything up. It also erases the heavy queer text surrounding Mystique, a character whose entire identity is based on how she is fluid. She could be male or female, but despite all of that, consistently, the only person in every version of X-Men that Mystique trusts implicitly is Destiny. The only consistent thing, despite everything, is her love about Destiny. She trusts Destiny, but the character was never adapted in the films. Instead, Mystique is in love with Beast, flirts with Magneto, flirts with Wolverine, but we never see her bond with Destiny, who's been there since the very beginning of Mystique's story. It's telling the X-Men film series is filled with gay or bisexual actors, and yet none of them play a gay character. I'm just saying, the entire fact that Iceman's character arc in that first trilogy of films is defined by him being in love with Rogue and being a closeted mutant gets more funny the longer I think about it. Authentically, it's one of the funniest things about that film. In hindsight, anyway. And yeah, I know the retcon was after the film started, but come on, even when Days of Future Past came out, the people making jokes about it. But actually, you know what? Speaking of Rogue, the first X-Men movie centers on Magneto using Rogue to power a device that turns people into mutants. Mutates, basically. The device bleaches Rogue's hair and almost kills her, if not for Wolverine briefly sacrificing his life force to help Rogue heal. But he gets better, don't worry. Simple concept, right? But you wonder what would have made it more messy and complicated, maybe even better? If they adapted Rogue's family from the comics. Because Rogue's parents in the comics are Mystique and Destiny, who raise Rogue. Yeah, Mystique and Destiny. Not disguised as anyone, but just Mystique and Destiny have a biological child, sure. Yeah, and this isn't like a retcon either. Mystique and Destiny are introduced as raising Rogue. In their very first appearance, it's all about Rogue. Yeah, they have an adoptive daughter. And I keep reading that. The fact that Destiny was not adapted is a travesty, because you lose so much of Mystique's actual comic storyline omitting Destiny. And again, every adaptation so far, aside from the X-Men films, has had Rogue be raised by Mystique and Destiny. And Mystique, by the way, actually does deeply care about Rogue. More so than Nightcrawler, definitely more than Graydon Creed. In fact, Rogue was a member of her Brotherhood of Mutants. She was the first founder of the Brotherhood of Mutants outside Magneto in the comics. Rogue was there during the assassination of Senator Kelly in the comics, or the attempted one anyway. And ironically, in the film, Mystique impersonates Senator Kelly after the machine she helps with Magneto out with turns him into a pile of goop. The same machine that Mystique wants Rogue to control. So what do we lose from removing Rogue as Mystique's daughter? Well, a lot actually. In the X-Men film, Mystique disguises herself as Bobby Drake, Iceman, the most heterosexual version of Iceman ever put to screen, to convince Rogue to leave the Xavier school after accidentally stealing some of Logan's power. This was also done so Mystique can then sabotage Cerebro, poisoning Xavier the next time he uses it to keep him out of the conflict. In short, it's a pretty major decision that helps Magneto finalize his plans. But in the process, we kind of ignore Rogue's family. In fact, the whole movie we kind of ignore Rogue's family. She runs away from home after kissing a boy, and we never hear from her family again because it didn't really matter. If Mystique was Rogue's adoptive mom, however, the entire structure of the story completely changes. And this isn't just that the whole scene stops working, the whole movie changes gears completely. It takes on a far more disturbing light if Mystique is the one who raised Rogue, transforms into her boyfriend to manipulate her, and then does all that to basically end her life. No, the film opens with Rogue running away from home out of fear her family will reject her for being a mutant, or out of guilt maybe. Well, now Mystique would be her mom, and would be a mutant, overtly so, a whole time. Because keep in mind, in the comics, Mystique doesn't disguise herself as someone else. She's just her blue-skinned form around Mystique all the time. Would Mystique maybe pretend to be Rogue's mom, impersonating her? Would that be a secret? Or did Rogue know the whole time in this hypothetical version? If Rogue is still running away, is she somehow involved in the plan that Magneto forms? Is she aware of it to some extent? Did Mystique groom Rogue for this whole purpose, this whole time? Is that how Magneto learned about Rogue? Through Mystique? See, there's so many disturbing implications that start up the moment you put Mystique in the role she occupies from the comics. And they only arise if Mystique is Rogue's mom. But the alternative is what we got in the films, where Rogue's family is irrelevant. It also ties Rogue to another character other than just Wolverine. And how much more powerful would that Mystique and Wolverine fight be if, on top of everything else, Logan knew Mystique groomed Rogue for this one purpose over the course of who God knows how long? How much more personal stakes can we put on this relationship that are just missing from the original film? In the film, it's a cool fight, but in this version, there's emotional weight behind it. And none of this is getting into the fact that Mystique wasn't even an X-Men villain at all. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that, did you? Didn't you know? Mystique wasn't created to be an X-Men villain. However, Mystique is responsible for so totally defeating a character she was originally paired up with to fight that, well, there's almost no point in a rematch between them after breaking someone so thoroughly. I am, of course, talking about Carol Danvers, then Miss Marvel, now Captain Marvel. That's right, Mystique was created as a Carol Danvers villain. Mystique's first fight with the X-Men was Days of Future Past, sure, where she basically helped destroy the future by assassinating Senator Kelly. However, that storyline was published in 1981. Mystique's first appearance was 1978 in the pages of Ms. Marvel issue 16. See, like I said before, Mystique deeply loved her adoptive daughter, Rogue. So much so that her first storyline, her first several years, is defined by her affection for Rogue. See, as Raven Darkholme, Mystique again ended up in a position of power, infiltrating the United States government. Specifically, she became the deputy director of DARPA in the Department of Defense. Pretty high-ranking role, and she got all these types of military secrets and weaponry and all that stuff, but she did it in order to protect her daughter, because Destiny had a prediction. Carol Danvers would do unspeakable harm to Rogue. So, in one of the few selfless acts Mystique has done up until this point, before Carol could hurt Rogue, Mystique tried to kill her. Mystique set out to kill Carol Danvers, and so she broke into S.H.I.E.L.D., got everything she needed to know about Carol Danvers, and went about trying to take down a literal walking god. She confronted Carol Danvers a number of times as Ms. Marvel, even fighting the Avengers, now with her Brotherhood of Mutants. All of this led to a plan Mystique orchestrated where Rogue could steal Carol Danvers' powers and use them against Carol. But during the struggle, something went wrong. Rogue absorbed more than she intended to. Rogue didn't just briefly take Carol's powers, no. She took them forever. She permanently depowered Carol. And not only that, but she took Carol's memories and persona too. It took Professor X to bring Carol back to some form of consciousness, but the event essentially broke Carol Danvers. She never really recovered from this. But Rogue also was in immense harm. You see, the irony of Destiny's prediction is that Carol Danvers did hurt Rogue. But Mystique, what can only be considered Greek tragedy, created the scenario that basically caused her daughter to be hurt by Carol Danvers. Rogue almost lost her mind because of Carol's memories jumbling up with her own, Carol's pain in her brain. She went to Professor X for help ultimately, who did what he could to ease Rogue's now fragmented psyche. What I think is a defining moment in both Rogue and Mystique's story, though, is that Mystique lets Rogue stay with the X-Men, knowing it's the best place for her daughter despite the hurt and pain she feels in seeing it all unfold, and despite initially thinking Professor X brainwashed Rogue and stole her from her. She's deeply loved her daughter, but she would grow to hate Charles Xavier even more for stealing what was hers away from her. Not blaming herself, but blaming Charles. I'm very amused Graydon Creed did not receive this treatment, because fuck that guy, frankly, but Mystique made him into a monster too. Oh, and then Mystique and her brotherhood dragged Magneto to the US government in exchange for a presidential pardon for all of her crimes. So Mystique gets away with everything. Which, yeah, honestly puts into contrast how bizarre it is that the films paired Mystique up with Magneto, considering Mystique almost got Magneto executed by a world court. Hell, Mystique has worked more with the US government than she has with Magneto in the comics, which is a whole other level of irony there. As for Carol Danvers, she descended into profound depression and alcoholism. Eventually, she did get some new powers, but she lost them. She went through several weird cycles of developing new powers and losing them and falling further and further from grace, until the events, ironically, of House of M. The events that powered a lot of mutants, where Carol briefly experiences an alternate version of herself as a hero, on par with Captain America or Iron Man. And this made her resolve to become a hero worthy of her title, by joining Iron Man during the events of Civil War. Not the best choice, Carol. Eventually, Carol Danvers became Captain Marvel that we all know about today. But I mean, baby steps. Do you think the MCU will be brave enough to adapt the arc where Rogue perma-steals Carol Danvers' powers and leaves her a broken husk? Somehow, I doubt it will be as bleak as the comics if they do that. By the way, this summary leaves out a lot of Mystique stories. There's a lot of Mystique stories over 50 years. Like when Destiny was killed, or when she learned Destiny was involved in this wild anti-mutant conspiracy. That gets forgotten a lot, I've noticed. Or, like I said before, when she sent Wolverine to hell, or that time she worked for Norman Osborn when he took over his shield, or all of the stuff Mystique and Destiny did during the Krakoa arc, which is a whole lot. And I don't have time to go into Krakoa all right now, because if we do a Krakoa video, it's going to be 5 hours long. That stuff's complicated, man. All of this shows that Mystique in the comics is this morally twisted character. She's only in it for herself, ultimately, and she'll use everyone around her, be it the government, the X-Men, the Avengers, the laws of physics and literature, to her advantage. She's a chaotically neutral character at the best of times, and just outright evil at the worst. But she's humanized due to her human relationships. She's the center of a soap opera, but her motives are always self-serving, which always hurts everyone else in the soap opera. She's not a part of a movement. She's not a pawn of someone else. She is the chess master, and she wants to win for her. And despite just being a shapeshifter, she's incredibly lethal and dangerous to everyone around her. She's not Magneto light like in the films. She's her own unique threat. She doesn't have a higher goal, always. She just does whatever it takes to survive and thrive, and on occasion, protect the few people she cares about. Even if, as we see with Rogue and Nightcrawler, over time, people grow to despise her, because they recognize Mystique not for well-intentioned terrorist or a tragic hero, but for the monster she ultimately is. Sometimes villains need to just be villains.
The growing menace of mutant violence.
My fellow Americans, I am an idiot.